I was told the mission was reconnaissance. Nothing more. 9 of us went into that forest under orders that didn't exist on paper. We were told to watch the sky, not the tree line, the sky. I didn't understand until the 3rd night when something with wings wider than our transport truck blotted out the stars, and the stars didn't come back the same. I am the only one who came out. I don't know if I count as out. I still hear wing beats in rooms with no windows. They came for me at 0300, and men who come for you at 0300 never bring good news. I was Sergeant Elias Cole, 6 years in, nothing special on paper, a competent soldier who followed orders and asked few questions. That night, 2 men in unmarked uniforms stood in my barracks doorway with a folder that had no unit crest, no classification stamp I recognized, just a black cover and my name typed on a strip of white tape. They didn't say reassignment, they said extraction. I remember thinking that was an odd word to use for your own soldier. The room they took me to had no windows. 6 other faces sat around a steel table, all of them wearing the same expression I probably wore, the careful blankness of men who'd learned not to show fear in front of strangers. Corporal Reyes cracked a joke about being kidnapped by his own government. Nobody laughed, but I remember being grateful he tried. The briefing officer who finally entered didn't introduce himself. He wore no rank insignia. He set a single manila folder on the table in his hand. I noticed this because I notice hands, an old habit from checking rifles, was trembling slightly as he opened it. "This mission does not exist," he said. "You do not exist for the duration of it. Whatever you sign tonight erases this room from your service record permanently." Someone asked what the objective was. He hesitated a half-second too long before answering. "Asset containment." "What asset?" The pause after that question stretched long enough that the hum of the ventilation system became the loudest thing in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped, like he was forcing the word out through something tight in his throat. "A bird." The room actually laughed. Reyes slapped the table. Private Okafor asked if we were being punked for some kind of psychological evaluation. I laughed too, I'll admit it, because the words sounded almost sweet against the horror movie atmosphere of that windowless room. A bird. We were soldiers being flown somewhere classified to guard against a bird. The officer did not laugh. He did not even smile. He simply closed the folder, and something about the stillness in his face made the laughter in the room curdle and die on its own, one throat at a time, until it was just 7 men breathing in recycled air, and 1 man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You'll be briefed further on site," he said. "Sign the documents." I signed. We all signed. I've turned that decision over in my mind more times than I can count since. Whether there was ever really a choice, whether refusing would have mattered, whether some other version of me in some other version of that night said no and walked out of that building into a life that still makes sense. I don't know. I only know the version of me that exists now signed his name on a line with no context, under a fluorescent light that buzzed like something trying to get free. The transport was a cargo plane with the markings stripped off the fuselage, the kind of aircraft that isn't supposed to be flying anywhere near American airspace under civilian radar. 6 hours in, somewhere over water none of us could name, Vance came aboard, the only civilian among us. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a government laptop chained to her wrist with a cable lock. She was a biologist, she said, when Okafor asked. She didn't elaborate. She spent the entire flight not looking at any of us, staring instead at a single manila folder, identical to the one from the briefing room, her thumb tracing the edge of it over and over like a worry stone. I asked her what kind of bird needed 9 armed men and a black-budget flight to contain. She looked up at me then, and for just a moment, one unguarded moment before she caught herself, something moved behind her eyes that I can only describe as grief. Not fear, grief. Like she already knew people were going to die and had made some private peace with the fact that she couldn't stop it. "You'll see," she said, and went back to staring at the folder. We landed on a runway with no name, no tower lights, No ground crew waving marshalling wands, just floodlights arranged in a rough grid across a strip of cracked asphalt swallowed on all sides by black forest. The air that hit me when the cargo door dropped was wrong before I could articulate why. Too cold for the season, too still, not a single insect sound, not a single bird call, in a forest that should have been full of them. Rhea stood beside me at the ramp, rifle slung, staring out at the tree line with the kind of forced casualness men use to convince themselves they aren't afraid. "Guess we'll meet the bird," he said. Neither of us laughed that time. We laughed about that word on the transport. We stopped laughing somewhere around the second checkpoint when the fences started facing inward. The fences should have told us everything if we'd been paying attention to the right details instead of the obvious ones. 3 checkpoints stood between the runway and the tree line, each one a chain-link perimeter topped with razor wire, each one manned by soldiers who wouldn't make eye contact as we passed. I noticed it at the second checkpoint and couldn't stop noticing it after that. The wire wasn't angled outward, the way you'd rig a fence to keep intruders from climbing in. It was angled inward, curved back over itself like a hook. Like the fence wasn't built to keep something out, it was built to keep something in. I mentioned it to Okafor. He just nodded slowly, like he'd already clocked it and decided it was better not to say anything out loud. We were given our final orders at the 3rd checkpoint by a colonel whose name tag had been taped over. Establish a perimeter 2 kilometers into the forest around a location designated only as Site Perch. Watch the sky. Report any aerial anomaly immediately. Do not, under any circumstances, use lethal force without direct authorization from Site Perch Command. "What are we watching for?" Reyes asked. "You'll know it when you see it," the colonel said, and that was the last useful thing anyone told us before we walked into the trees. The forest swallowed the floodlights within the first 100 meters. What replaced them was a darkness that felt deeper than it should have, a black that seemed to absorb the beam of every flashlight we carried instead of scattering it back. Our boots on the frozen ground made a sound too loud in the silence. No birds, no wind through branches, no insects, nothing but 9 sets of footsteps and the occasional hiss of a radio checking in with static instead of words. The compasses went first. I noticed mine spinning lazily about 40 minutes in, the needle drifting in slow circles with no fixed point to settle on. I tapped the housing, assumed a fault, kept walking. Then Vance's voice came over the comm, tight and clipped, asking if anyone else's equipment was malfunctioning. 4 other voices answered yes within seconds. 5 broken compasses in one patrol is not a coincidence. It's a pattern, and patterns in a place like that should have scared us more than they did. The radios were worse. Somewhere around the 2nd hour, the static stopped being static. I want to be precise about this because I've spent a long time trying to convince myself I imagined it, and I know now that I didn't. The white noise on the channel resolved, just for a few seconds at a time, into something with rhythm. A rise, a fall, a pause exactly where a breath would go if something enormous were breathing into a microphone from very far away. Nobody said anything about it on the comm. I think we were all hoping someone else would say it first, so we could dismiss it as one man's imagination instead of something we all shared. It was Reyes who noticed the trees. We'd been walking maybe 3 hours, navigating by dead reckoning since the compasses were useless, when he stopped dead in front of a birch tree, split down the middle by old lightning damage, its trunk blackened in a shape almost like a screaming mouth. "We passed this," he said. Nobody answered. He said it again, louder, and there was an edge in his voice I hadn't heard from him before, not even during live fire exercises. "We passed this exact tree 2 hours ago. I remember the shape. I remember thinking it looked like a face." Vance checked her GPS device, frowning at a screen that should have told her exactly where we stood, and instead gave her a scatter of coordinates that made no geographic sense. Readings that placed us simultaneously 3 kilometers apart from each other, despite standing shoulder to shoulder in a clearing barely 10 meters wide. We pushed forward anyway because that's what training does to you. It fills the silence where terror should be with procedure, with the next step, with the comforting lie that forward motion means progress. We marched for another hour. We found the same split birch tree twice more. By the fourth time, Reyes had stopped mentioning it. He walked past it in silence, jaw tight, refusing to look at it directly, and something in the set of his shoulders told me he'd made a decision not to acknowledge it anymore, as if naming the impossible thing gave it more power over him than ignoring it did. I understood the impulse. I felt it myself, later, more times than I can count. We finally broke from the trees into a clearing around midnight, and ahead of us, half buried in earth and camouflage netting, sat a research outpost that hadn't existed on any map I'd ever seen. Concrete and steel sunk into the hillside like a bunker, built to survive something far worse than an artillery strike. Lights glowed faintly behind reinforced windows. Antenna arrays bristled from the roof, all of them angled skyward instead of outward. Vance stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared up at those antennas for a long moment before she spoke. "Welcome to Site Perch," she said, and her voice had none of the relief I expected from someone finally reaching shelter. Corporal Reyes was the first to notice we'd passed the same broken birch 3 times. He was also the first to stop talking about it. The people inside Site Perch had the eyes of men who'd stopped sleeping properly a long time ago. I counted maybe 15 personnel moving through the underground corridors when they let us in. Scientists in stained lab coats, technicians hunched over banks of monitors, displaying readouts I couldn't interpret, and a handful of soldiers stationed at intervals along the walls who watched us pass with an expression I can only describe as pity. Not hostility, pity. Like they were looking at men who didn't yet understand what they'd volunteered for. Vance led us through the facility with the ease of someone who'd walked its halls 1,000 times before, past doors marked with designations instead of names. Containment Sublevel 2, Acoustic Monitoring, Sample Archive. And none of the personnel we passed made eye contact with any of us. I noticed that pattern too. Nobody in that building looked directly at anyone else for longer than a second, as if eye contact itself had become something people there had learned to avoid. They put us up in a barracks room stripped down to bare bunks and a single fluorescent light that flickered on a 2-second interval. On, off, in a rhythm too consistent to be a wiring fault. I lay awake that first night listening to it, and to the deep, almost subsonic hum that ran through the concrete walls. A vibration I felt more than heard, like standing near an enormous engine idling somewhere far below the facility's foundations. Around 200, I gave up on sleep and went looking for water in the mess hall, and found Vance there instead, alone at a steel table with a laptop open in front of her and 3 fingers of something amber in a paper cup that definitely wasn't approved for a classified research site. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked like she'd been waiting for someone to walk in. "You have questions," she said. "Everyone here does. Nobody's answering them." She turned the laptop screen toward me, and what I saw on it took a moment to resolve into something my mind could categorize. A photograph, high resolution, of a single feather laid across a measuring table beside a standard issue rifle for scale. The feather was longer than the rifle. Its barbs were the deep matte black of something that seemed to drink the light around it rather than reflect it. And along its central shaft ran a pattern of faint luminescence, like veins carrying something that glowed instead of blood. "Recovered 11 years ago," Vance said, "from a molt site 4 kilometers from where we're sitting." I asked what kind of bird sheds a feather that size. She laughed, a short, humorless sound, and clicked to the next image. A fragment of bone, curved and pitted with age, dated by an isotope analysis readout that made no sense to me except for one detail she pointed out with a trembling finger. The estimated age exceeded 200,000 years. The bone showed no fossilization. "That's not possible," I said. "Organic material that old should be stone by now." "It should be," she agreed. "It isn't. Do you know what that tells us?" I didn't. "It tells us the timeline is wrong. Either the dating method is catastrophically broken, or that bone belonged to something that isn't aging the way things are supposed to age. Something outside the normal rules." She closed the laptop, and her hands, I noticed, would not stop shaking. We've been studying it for over a decade. We don't have a name for it that means anything. The internal designation is Perch 1. Command likes to call it the asset. I call it... She stopped herself. What do you call it? She looked at me for a long moment, and something behind her exhaustion cracked open, just slightly, just enough to let something true slip through before her training clamped back down over it. It's not extinct, she said quietly. It's waiting. I asked her what it was waiting for. She wouldn't answer that. She closed the laptop fully, gathered it against her chest like something she needed to protect, and stood to leave, pausing at the doorway with her back to me. The soil readings around this facility don't measure radioactive contamination the way you'd expect, she said. They measure it in geometric patterns, concentric rings, expanding outward from a fixed point 2 kilometers north of here. Radiation doesn't organize itself into deliberate shapes, Sergeant. Not unless something is generating it on purpose. Not unless something is marking territory. She left before I could ask another question, and I sat alone in that mess hall with the flickering light and the subsonic hum in the walls, staring at a closed laptop that no longer existed in the room, trying to understand what kind of animal leaves feathers longer than rifles, and bones that refuse to fossilize, and radiation that arranges itself into rings around a fixed point, like something breathing slowly in its sleep. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. None of us did, I found out later, comparing notes with Okafor and Reyes over breakfast rations that tasted like cardboard and felt like the last normal meal any of us would eat. Vance told me one truth before she caught herself. It's not extinct. It's waiting. I wish she'd stayed silent. Gravity is not supposed to be optional. That's the thought I kept returning to afterward, in the weeks and months that followed, whenever I tried to make sense of what happened on our first night stationed at the outer perimeter of Site Perch. Gravity is a constant. It's the one thing a soldier learns to trust absolutely, the invisible hand that keeps your boots on the ground and your rounds falling true, and the entire architecture of the physical world stitched together in a way that makes sense. I had never once in my life questioned it. I question it now, every single day. We'd been posted in a loose perimeter formation around a coordinate 2 kilometers north of the facility, the same coordinate, I realized later, at the center of Vance's concentric radiation rings. Reyes and Okafor held the eastern flank with me. The rest of the squad spread out through the trees at intervals we could barely maintain given how the compasses still refused to settle and how the forest seemed to fold distances in ways that made no sense on paper. Around 0140, a sensor technician's voice crackled over the comm, tight with something that wasn't quite panic yet, but was close. We have a thermal signature. Repeat, thermal signature at grid 7, requesting confirmation. I asked for size and range. The answer came back after a pause that lasted far too long. Estimated height, 11 stories. Signature is stationary. Hold position, do not engage. 11 stories. I remember laughing, not from humor, but from the particular kind of disbelief that laughs because the alternative is screaming, and looking at Reyes, whose face had gone the color of old paper in the dim green light of his night vision. Neither of us said anything. We just raised our weapons toward the darkness between the trees and waited for something we had no framework to understand. The signature vanished from the sensors 90 seconds later. Just gone, the technician reported. No movement detected, no explanation for the disappearance of something that size in open forest. We stood in that silence for almost 20 minutes, weapons trained on nothing, waiting for a threat that had apparently ceased to exist. I was starting to let my shoulders drop, starting to believe maybe it had been a sensor malfunction after all, when the ground beneath my boots simply stopped holding me. I want to describe this precisely because no description I've given anyone since has ever felt adequate. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a shockwave. There was no sound at all in the instant it happened, just a sudden and total absence of weight. My body lifting from the forest floor in complete silence, my rifle drifting upward out of my grip as though we were both underwater. My stomach lurching with the specific nausea of falling, except I was falling upward. And around me in the darkness, I could hear Reyes and Okafor making sounds that weren't quite screams, more like the involuntary noise a body makes when its most fundamental assumption about the world has just been proven wrong. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then gravity returned all at once, and I slammed back down onto frozen ground hard enough to drive the air from my lungs, my rifle clattering somewhere out of reach in the dark, my ears ringing with a high whine that took long minutes to fade. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. What was there to say? Reyes was on his hands and knees a few meters away, breathing in ragged gasps, and even in the poor light I could see his hands trembling against the dirt. It was Okafor who heard it first, a sound rising from somewhere deep in the trees to the north, at the exact coordinate the sensors had marked. I've tried for years to find language that captures what that sound actually was, and I've never managed it. It began low, almost like a foghorn, a bass note that I felt in my chest before I registered it in my ears. Then it rose, splitting into something layered and complex, a call that had the melodic shape of birdsong stretched across too wide a register, threaded through with something that had cadence, that had structure, that sounded, God help me, almost like syllables. It called 3 times, each call closer than the last, though nothing in the darkness ever showed itself. Then silence returned to the forest, total and absolute, and none of us moved for almost an hour, waiting for a 4th call that never came. We told ourselves it was thunder. Thunder doesn't answer when you scream at it. Reyes screamed at the sky that night, and something screamed back. It happened maybe an hour after the 3rd call, when the silence had stretched long enough that some of us had convinced ourselves the worst was over. Reyes stood up from where he'd been crouched against a tree, rifle forgotten at his side, and shouted into the darkness above the canopy. Words I won't repeat, the raw, furious terror of a man who needed the universe to answer him so he could at least know what he was fighting. The forest answered with the same 3-note call from before, except this time it came from directly overhead, not from the trees, from the sky itself, as though the source of the sound had simply relocated to somewhere above the cloud layer in the span of a single breath, covering a distance that should have taken minutes to travel in less than a second. That was when I noticed the compasses again. Every needle among us, without exception, had stopped their aimless spinning and now pointed straight up. Vance's voice came through the comm from the facility, and for the first time since we'd met her, she sounded less like a scientist reciting data and more like a woman watching something she'd feared for years finally begin. We're reading atmospheric distortion at your position. Get eyes on the sky, now. I looked up, and the stars were wrong. I don't mean unfamiliar constellations, some trick of unfamiliar latitude. I mean the stars I'd looked at every night of my deployment, stars whose positions I'd unconsciously memorized the way soldiers do, had rearranged themselves into a pattern that made no astronomical sense. Clustering, drifting, some of them visibly moving against the black in slow, deliberate arcs, like they were being dragged by something with a plan. Then low on the northern horizon, a line of pure black tore across the sky. I use the word tear deliberately because that's exactly what it looked like. Not a cloud, not a shadow, but a jagged seam opening across the fabric of the night itself, edges rippling like burnt paper, and behind that seam was not more darkness, but a deeper absence, a black that made the surrounding night sky look almost bright by comparison. The temperature around us dropped so fast that frost formed visibly on my rifle barrel in seconds. My breath came out in thick clouds. Somewhere behind me, Okafor was praying in a language I didn't recognize, fast and quiet and desperate. The seam widened, and an eye opened within it. I need you to understand the scale of what I'm describing, because scale is the thing that broke something in me that night that has never fully repaired. This was not an eye the size of a building. It was not the size of a mountain. When it opened, a slow, deliberate unveiling, like a lid lifting after some unimaginable stretch of sleep, its iris alone spanned a portion of visible sky comparable to the moon at its largest. a churning amber gold color shot through with veins of that same faint bioluminescence Vance had shown me in the feather photograph. And at its center, a pupil that was not round but slitted, vertical, ancient, and utterly, unmistakably aware. It looked down. I've been shot at. I've had rounds crack past my head close enough to feel the heat. Nothing compares to the specific violation of being seen by something that size. It wasn't fear in the way I understood fear before that moment. It was smaller than fear and somehow infinitely larger. It was the sensation of my entire existence, every choice I'd ever made, every person I'd ever loved, being cataloged and weighed and found in some vast, impatient calculation, almost entirely without significance. Okafor's voice cut through the calm, no longer praying, just repeating one sentence over and over in a voice climbing toward hysteria. "It's looking at us. It's looking at us. It's looking at us." He was wrong, I realized, in a way that terrified me more than the alternative would have. It wasn't looking at us specifically. We were simply within the field of something looking at everything at once. The seam began to close. The eye did not blink so much as fold, layer over layer of something like a lid, drawing shut with a sound I felt in my teeth, a deep, grinding pressure, like tectonic plates shifting somewhere far above the atmosphere. Within seconds, the sky returned to something resembling normal. Stars scattered back into approximately familiar patterns, the black seam gone as though it had never opened at all. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The forest around us remained utterly, unnaturally silent, and somewhere in that silence I understood with total clarity that whatever we had just witnessed had not been an accident, and it had not been the entirety of what waited above us. It had been an introduction. Private Okafor said it felt like being read, not seen. He was right, and it hadn't even fully arrived yet. Vance's voice broke over the calm before dawn, and what she told us rewired everything I thought I understood about the mission. "Site Perch was never a research station," she said, her words coming fast, stripped of the careful professional distance she'd maintained since we'd arrived. "It's a containment barrier. We built it over the entity's dormancy site 14 years ago after the first breach event. The barrier isn't a fence, Sergeant. It's not concrete or steel. It's a suppression field generated from beneath the facility, and I'm reading catastrophic degradation in the last 6 hours. It's failing. It's been failing since you arrived." I asked her, my voice barely steady, what exactly the barrier had been holding back. She didn't answer with words. She answered by patching video from a ground-penetrating array through to our tactical displays, and what appeared on the small screen strapped to my forearm made my hands go numb around my rifle. Beneath the forest floor, spanning a chamber that the readout estimated at nearly 1 kilometer across, something vast lay curled in on itself. A shape built from silhouette and shadow, more than clear detail, but unmistakably organic, unmistakably alive, its outline suggesting folded wings the length of city blocks, and a form that seemed to shift subtly even in a still image, as though the camera itself struggled to render something that didn't fully agree to exist in 3 dimensions. "That's not possible," I said. "Nothing that size could survive underground. The physics don't." "The physics don't apply," Vance snapped, and I heard something in her voice finally shatter. 14 years of careful composure giving way all at once. "That's what none of you understand. It was never following our physics. We built a cage around something that only chose to be contained, and now it's choosing something else." The ground began to move before she finished the sentence. Not an earthquake, nothing so simple. The forest floor around us rippled outward in slow, deliberate waves, tree roots tearing free of soil that no longer held its shape, trunks leaning at angles no living tree should survive, the entire landscape flexing like the surface of something enormous, drawing its first full breath in 14 years. Then the trees ahead of us simply weren't there anymore. I don't mean they fell. I mean the space they occupied stopped containing them. A section of forest perhaps 200 meters wide simply erased and replaced by open black sky where a canopy had stood seconds before. and rising up through that impossible gap came wings. I will never find language sufficient for what I saw in that moment, and I've stopped trying to pretend I can. The wings did not simply unfold the way a bird's wings unfold. They unfolded through the landscape around them, each downward beat rewriting the terrain beneath, trees flattening and regrowing in the same instant, the temperature swinging from Arctic cold to humid heat and back within a single breath. The tree line itself seeming to exist in two configurations simultaneously before settling on one. Feathers longer than the transport plane that had flown us in caught what little light remained and scattered it in colors that had no names. Colors my eyes kept sliding off of because some part of my brain refused to process wavelengths that shouldn't exist. It rose and kept rising, far beyond any scale I could reconcile with a living creature, until its full silhouette blotted out what remained of the sky above the clearing. A shape built from beak and talon and feather, stretched into something that mimicked a bird the way a nightmare mimics a memory, recognizable enough to trigger something ancient and animal in my nervous system, wrong enough that recognizing it did nothing to prepare me for it. Reyes fired first. I don't blame him. Training takes over when the mind has nothing left to offer, and his round struck something that should have been flesh and instead produced no blood, no visible wound, nothing but a ripple across the surface of the creature, like a stone dropped into still water, the disturbance spreading outward and simply fading without consequence. The creature turned its head toward the sound and made eye contact with Corporal Reyes. He did not scream. That's the detail that haunts me most, more than anything else from that night. He simply stopped, mid-motion, rifle still raised, and his face went slack in a way I'd only ever seen on the recently dead, except he was still standing, still breathing, his eyes fixed on that impossible gaze with an expression of complete and total blankness, as though whatever made him Reyes had been quietly removed from behind his eyes in the span of a single look. "Vance!" I shouted into the comm, my voice cracking. "What do we do? Tell me what we do." Her answer came through broken by static, by something in the atmosphere itself interfering with the signal. Fragments of sentences bleeding together until only a handful of words came through clearly. "Never built to stop it, only ever built to keep it asleep. It's not attacking you, Sergeant. It's remembering what you are." Vance screamed that we'd built the barrier to keep it asleep, not to keep it out. It was already awake when we arrived. We were never guards. We were an offering scheduled for delivery. I lost Reyes first, and I lost him without a single shot fired against him. He simply walked, slow, deliberate steps directly toward the creature's shadow, rifle hanging forgotten from his shoulder, his face still wearing that terrible slackness that had settled over him the moment their eyes had met. I screamed his name until my throat tore raw. I grabbed his arm and he shrugged me off with a strength that didn't belong to the Reyes I'd known for 3 days. A strength that felt borrowed from somewhere else entirely, and he kept walking, unhurried, into the vast black silhouette that hung over the clearing like a held breath. He didn't cry out when he reached it. He simply stopped existing at the edge of that shadow, the way a shape stops existing when a light source moves and the shadow shifts to swallow it whole. 1 second he was there, the next the space where he'd been contained nothing at all, not even displaced air. And I stood there with my hand still outstretched toward a person who had been beside me a heartbeat earlier, and now simply, categorically, was not. I want to tell you the horror ended there. It didn't. It was only beginning. The world around the rest of us began folding in ways I still cannot describe without my hands shaking. Distances stopped being consistent. Okafor, 10 meters ahead of me, would suddenly seem 100 meters distant with the next blink. Then directly beside me the blink after that. The geometry of the clearing refusing to settle on a single configuration, as though space itself had become negotiable in the creature's presence. Time behaved no better. I remember firing my rifle and hearing the shot land before I remember pulling the trigger. I remember conversations with squad members that I have no memory of beginning, mid-sentence fragments dropping into my awareness from a timeline that didn't connect to the one I was living. Vance's voice kept breaking through the comm in pieces, And what I understood of it painted a picture worse than anything I'd imagined walking into that forest 3 days earlier. The barrier beneath Site Perch had never been designed to destroy or expel the entity. It had been designed 14 years earlier, after the first documented breach, as a sedative field, something to keep an entity beyond human comprehension in a state of dormancy while better minds than ours tried to understand what to do with a truth too large for any government to admit existed. We hadn't been sent to guard against an attack. We'd been sent as fresh personnel to replace a garrison that command suspected, correctly, was already failing. Soldiers whose extended proximity to the suppression field had begun breaking down in ways nobody upstairs wanted documented. We were never meant to stop anything. We were meant to be noticed, so the true garrison could be quietly evacuated while the creature's attention settled on us instead. I didn't have time to process the full weight of that betrayal, because that was the moment Vance's transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by the deep, grinding roar of the facility's own emergency alarm, and a new voice, command, someone with authority I'd never heard before, cutting through every channel at once with an order that made my blood run colder than the Arctic air around us. All units, this is a cascade directive. Site Perch is compromised beyond recovery. Detonation sequence will initiate in 90 seconds. All personnel are to consider themselves already lost. This transmission will not be repeated. 90 seconds. I looked around the clearing at what remained of my squad. Okafor on his knees, hands pressed over his ears, rocking with a rhythm that matched nothing happening around him. 2 others I'd barely learned the names of, backs pressed against a boulder, weapons raised uselessly at a sky that no longer obeyed the rules weapons were built to counter. And above all of it, that vast, shifting silhouette, patient, unhurried, watching us the way something enormous watches insects it hasn't yet decided are worth stepping on. I found the detonation trigger in my kit exactly where the briefing officer had told me it would be. 3 days and a lifetime ago, in a windowless room that felt like it belonged to someone else's memory now. My thumb hovered over it while the countdown in my head ran faster than the 90 seconds command had given us. I want to tell you I pressed it out of duty, out of some soldier's calculus that said saving the wider world justified sacrificing the handful of us still breathing in that clearing. That would be a comforting lie, and I've decided I owe whoever reads this account the truth instead. I pressed it because I could not survive one more second of remembering what I had already seen. And detonation felt, in that moment, like the only door out of a room that had no other exits. The world went white before the sound reached me. I didn't press the trigger for duty. I pressed it because staying meant remembering everything I'd seen, and I could no longer afford to. I woke in a hospital bed with clean white sheets and no memory of how I got there. And the first thing I noticed was that my hands didn't shake anymore. That should have comforted me. It didn't. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate to the doctors who examined me over the following weeks, running scans that found nothing. No burns, no shrapnel, no trace of the frostbite that should have marked skin exposed to Arctic cold for 3 days straight. No evidence at all that my body had endured anything beyond an ordinary training exercise. When I asked about my squad, about Reyes and Okafor and the others, whose faces I could still see clearly whenever I closed my eyes, the answers I received were uniform in their blankness. There was no record of those men in my unit. There was no record of a mission matching my description. My official service file listed 3 days of leave, unremarkable, spent at an address I don't recognize. I tried for a while to find Vance. I searched every public research database, every biology department at every university I could think to check, looking for a woman with tired eyes and a laptop chained to her wrist who had told me the truth for one unguarded moment before catching herself. I never found her. I'm no longer certain I ever will, or that finding her would give me anything except confirmation of what I already believe, that the people who knew the truth were made, one way or another, to stop knowing it. The debrief form I was eventually handed, months later, listed my mission under a single bureaucratic phrase: Training Exercise, Alaska. No further detail. No acknowledgement of sight perch, of the barrier, of the thing that unfolded itself through the fabric of a forest clearing and erased a man named Reyes without spilling a single drop of his blood. I signed it because refusing to sign felt, by that point, like a door I no longer had the strength to push against. I live an ordinary life now, on paper. I go to work, I eat meals, I sleep most nights. Though sleep brings its own difficulties, I won't detail here, except to say that certain sounds, a specific low-frequency hum, the particular cadence of wind moving through trees at exactly the wrong pitch, can still put me on the floor with my hands pressed over my ears before I've consciously registered why. What I carry now, more than the fear, more than the grief for men whose names exist nowhere except inside my own skull, is a colder kind of understanding that I've never found a way to set down. I used to believe, the way I think most people believe without examining it too closely, that humanity occupied some meaningful position in the order of things. That whatever else was true about the universe, we mattered enough to be the main subject of our own story. I don't believe that anymore. I watch the sky sometimes, at night, from a house with too many lights on and doors I check twice before sleeping, and I no longer see it the way I used to. I see a barrier. I see something that might, in certain conditions, tear open along a seam I've already witnessed once. And I understand now that whatever waits on the other side of that seam does not hate us, does not hunt us out of malice, does not even particularly notice us most of the time, the way we don't notice the insects living in the grass beneath our feet until something disturbs them into visibility. We are not the center of anything. We are contained, watched, cataloged by something so far beyond our understanding that our entire species amounts to a detail it occasionally, idly, glances toward. Somewhere beneath a forest that no longer appears on any map I can find, or perhaps somewhere far above the clouds we were always told were simply empty sky, something ancient continues its patient, unhurried existence, entirely indifferent to whether we ever learn the truth of what it is. I signed papers that erased my mission from history. I can't erase what I saw. And some nights, lying awake with the lights on and my hands finally still, I find myself wondering if that silence, the government's silence, the world's collective unknowing, isn't a cover-up at all, but a mercy. I'm no longer sure humanity could survive knowing what I know. I'm no longer sure it needs to. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.